So the next text of Derrida's that I want to discuss here is to be found in the book called Dissemination, and it is called Plato's Pharmacy, and it's one of Derrida's best texts, I think, and it dates from 1968. 1968 was a big year for him. It seems to be a year where he had this creative explosion where all these texts started coming out, and he started articulating all his basic concepts, all the major ones that seemed to come out at this time. And what Plato's Pharmacy gives us then, it's a very long essay, and it's in two parts. It basically amounts to the length of a short book, and what I want to do in this video is talk only about the first half, part one, which is a very long text unto itself. And what it does is it gives, for the first time really, I think, a concrete example of what he means by the concept of the trace. What a trace is, what it does, and how it destabilizes a traditional logocentric philosophical system. So it gives us a concrete example of this. And so what he does then is he gives a very close and detailed reading of Plato's text called the Phaedrus. And if you decide to read this text, it's best if you sit down and reread the Phaedrus first before doing so. The Phaedrus basically is a text in which the following events transpire. It pictures Socrates being led out for the first, and so far as I know in Plato's text, the only time out beyond the limits of the city. Socrates is a city man. He's, as Nietzsche pointed out, he's the avatar of city intellect and city consciousness. So he's not normally accustomed to going out into the countryside. But this text depicts him going out into the countryside, and he's led there by a young man named Phaedrus. And Phaedrus has on him a copy of a text of a speech written by a man named Lysias in praise of love. What it means to be in love and be infatuated. And he has this text with him, and Phaedrus has told Socrates about this speech, and it has lured him out beyond the limits of the city to the river Ilissus. And so they walk out there, and there's a nice shady tree there, and they walk out there. And the first thing Phaedrus says is to Socrates is, isn't this the place where Oreithyia was swept away in legend by Boreas, the north wind? And apparently the myth is that Oreithyia was a young virgin who was playing by the banks of the river Ilissus with another virgin named Pharmakon. Significantly, this is the first occurrence of the word pharmacy, Pharmakon, in the text. And Plato will play with this term, Pharmakon, all through this text as a term that will become an analogy basically for writing. And she was playing with this girl named Pharmacia, and she was swept off while she was playing by the north wind. So the idea is that Pharmacia led her astray, and in the same manner, Socrates mentions to Phaedrus as they're going out, you've led me out here by this drug, this Pharmakon, referring to the speech that Phaedrus is going to talk to him about. You've led me out here by this, or normally I wouldn't have come out here. And he compares himself to the horse following the carrot. Being let out by the lure of the pleasure of a significant philosophical discussion. So they go and they arrange themselves under the tree, and Socrates tells him he says, okay, tell me about the text. And Lysias now has not mastered the text. He has not memorized it by rote. All these details are important for Derrida's discussion, every single one of them. He has not mastered it by verbal memorization, and so he says, well, I haven't memorized it exactly, but what I'd like to do is paraphrase it for you, if you don't mind. And Socrates says, no, I do mind. What I want you to do is read the text, because I see there under your robe that you're carrying it with you. And Phaedrus says, okay, actually you're right. I do have Lysias' speech here, and if you prefer, then I'll go ahead and read it. And so Socrates significantly wants him to read the text. So he proceeds to read what is actually a rather poorly composed text about love, full of banalities and trivialities, which then Socrates makes fun of, laughs at, and then goes into one of the beautiful Platonic descriptions of what love is really all about, how it has to do with an anamnesis, or a memory of how the soul grows wings at remembering and recollecting the sight of the beauty that reminds it of the beauty that it saw, between lives, between incarnations, in the realm of the forms, and all this wonderful Platonic stuff, this wonderful discourse on love. And then after they finish this discussion, they move right in about halfway through the text into a discussion about speech-making and writing, and the various merits and do's and don'ts of speech-making and writing. And it's in this speech, near the end of the dialogue itself, that Socrates says, there's a myth that I would like to recount for you that it was passed down to us by the Egyptians, and it talks about how the god Tot, who is the Egyptian god who is associated with writing, introduced to King Tamus writing there. And so Phaedrus says, do tell. And so Socrates, and this is the key myth that Derrida's whole discussion centers around in the text, and it appears to have been a myth invented by Plato himself. And in the myth, it depicts how Tot goes to King Tamus. Now, Tamus is simply a translation or mistranslation of Amun, the Egyptian ram god, who was the great solar ram god who was syncretized with the god Re, Amun-Re. So basically what it is the god Tot going to the god Amun, who is the high god, the sun god, the solar god. Tot is a moon god, and introducing writing to him. So it's a conversation between two gods. And Tot goes up to him and introduces. Tot is the god who is associated with the introduction of all these various kinds of arts and sciences, astronomy, games, in addition to writing and record keeping and calendrical. He's also a mortuary god, all of these things. And here he runs them past Tamus / Amun. And finally he comes to writing, and he says, there's another thing I'd like to introduce to you, and this is called writing. And what it will do is it will act as a Pharmakon, and he uses the word Pharmakon, but it's translated here as remedy. It's a remedy that will help men remember better. They will remember things better. And Tamus says, no. What it will actually do is efface and erode memory. People will stop using their memory, and they will come to rely upon writing, on studying these tiny little marks on a page that are exterior to memory. They will come to rely upon this. And this will, instead of relying upon memory, and this will give them the illusion of wisdom, which they won't really possess. They'll come to rely upon writing, and they'll think that they have knowledge of things which they don't, in fact, really have. And they'll be difficult to get on with because they'll basically be conceited and be full of knowledge, appear to be full of knowledge, have the semblance of knowledge, but will not actually, in fact, have it. And so this won't be a good thing. Now, the interesting thing about this myth is that what Derrida focuses on is the Greek word in the text is pharmakon, which is the word that is, in Greek, the word pharmakon means both remedy and it also means poison. So it's an undecidable in that it contains opposite meanings in it, remedy as well as poison. And the translator, the poor translator that Derrida picks on here, who translates this text by Plato, has to decide what the meanings are going to be when he translates it into English, and he chooses to render it as remedy in this case, which then lays the metaphysical foundation or the basis for then King Tamus or the god Amun to turn around and say, it won't be a remedy, it'll be a poison. Neil Postman, by the way, this is one of the main texts that he quotes in his writings. Postman always had the idea that every time a new technology is introduced, what we always fail to do, what we always overlook, is the fact that every new technology that comes along will undo some previous way of life. It will rupture, disrupt, dismantle, and deconstruct a previous mode of existence while making new things possible. And he always quoted this text to that effect. And I think that Postman is dead on here. This is a kind of early media studies text that questions the value of new technologies when they come along. And I think that we could learn something from this text, from Plato's attitude toward writing here, which is largely condemnatory, even though, keeping in mind the irony of the fact that Plato was a writer and Socrates was not. Socrates didn't leave any writings, Plato did, and here he's condemning writing. And this is the start of the logocentric tradition that Derrida has been battling all along, in which he says that speech is always, in the dichotomy, the metaphysical opposition of speech versus writing, speech is always upheld, and writing is always seen as supplemental, as a mere supplementary thing added onto it. Such that we have in the myth, the god Amun is a sun god, and he represents basically the logos, the interior self-sufficient presence, the Heideggerian Vorhandenheit in the mode of self-sufficient presence, and who has no need of writing, and sees writing as a supplement. Tot, the god, or the funerary god, brings writing to him and offers it to him, but it's merely seen by Amun as supplemental, something that's not necessary to the presence of the word, in the capital sense of the word, the creative logos Amun is a god that is similar to the Egyptian creator god Ptah, and after whom Egypt is named. The name Egypt comes from Hekaptah, the land of the god Ptah, and Ptah was a Memphite, the god who created with the power of the word. He simply spoke, and each word that he spoke, just like Yahweh on the first page of the book of Genesis, had concrete physical effects that brought about ontological and cosmological transformations in the very nature of reality. So Amun is a god who is at the center of presence and speech and has no need for writing. Writing is something that is dead. And Derrida is going to great pains in this text to show you that right at the start of the metaphysical tradition of the West, speech has been elevated over writing. Writing is regarded purely as something that's supplemental to speech in Plato's text. But now notice, too, we have a number of ambiguities to notice in this text. Notice that the relationship between Phaedrus and Socrates replicates structurally the relationship between Tot and Amun, or Tamos. Amun. Insofar as Socrates is in a role, Socrates leaves no writings and didn't do any writings, and he is in a role that's analogous to Amun. That is to say, they are both exemplars of the metaphysics of presence that Derrida is deconstructing in all of his works. They are both the living speech. They both exemplify speech at its source, the living, self-sufficient presence that has no need for writing and sees writing as only supplemental. And both Tot and Phaedrus are in similar roles as well. Tot offers writing to Amun just as Phaedrus has the concrete actual text of the speech of Lysias on love that he therefore has to read from, while Socrates is in the role of pronouncing judgment on it. So Socrates is in the role of a commentator on this text, but Socrates is the one who has presence with a capital P. He's the one who's at the direct speechifying fount of the metaphysical tradition, such that everything he utters will become basically constitutive, archetypally in a structural Platonic sense of the entire structure of the Western metaphysical tradition. He's setting it up here. Plato is setting it up. And so Derrida, he does bring you these subtle structures to your awareness. He wants you to see what these structures are. And then he also goes into, at this point now, in order to bring to mind, the word Pharmakon, as we saw, is a classic Derridian undecidable. It's a word that contains, it's actually a trace. The word Pharmakon itself that Plato uses for writing is a Derridian trace because it contains multiple significations, a multiple play of signifiers within it. It means both remedy and poison, both cure and that which causes the damage. And he goes into then, at this point, an interesting discourse analyzing the role of the god Tot in ancient Egypt. And he says that Tot was the god, he was a mortuary god, and he was the god of writing, but he is also a god who represents a kind of floating signifier in Egyptian mythology. He's plugged in a lot of different places and in a lot of different roles and a lot of different ways. For example, there is a text in which Re, the sun god, who's about to descend down beneath the underworld on a night sea journey, says to Tot, "Come take over my role." He's a moon god. Tot is a moon god. "Come take over my role, and you will substitute for me as the luminary at night while I go underneath the earth." So we see Tot being supplemental. Just as writing is supplemental to speech, so we see Tot being put in the role of a substitute, a supplement to the sun god Re. And in some traditions, there are some texts that Derrida quotes to the effect that the sun god Re would carry the dead on his barge, and he would have a scribe there with him. And sometimes the dead man, it might be Tot, and sometimes the dead man would then come in and substitute the role of Tot, and the dead man himself would then become the scribe of Re. And Tot himself is a slippery deity. He is a lunar god. He's associated with the ibis. The ibis has a long curved beak. It's curved like the crescent moon. He's also associated, though Derrida doesn't mention this, but Tot is also associated with the baboon. The baboon is actually a solar association because the baboon greets the rising sun with a yelp, with a yowl. But the association with Tot is also that baboons like to count their fingers, or it was thought that they like to count their fingers. So they become linked with Tot insofar as he's the god of numbers and mathematics and arithmetic. He's also a mortuary god, and so he embodies all these different pairs of oppositions. Now originally, and here's something else Derrida doesn't tell you, that further illustrates, though, the supplemental, the floating signifier nature of Tot. Tot is a trace here. It's is a trace, not a metaphysical term that's set in stone, the way the sun god rays sort of is. He's a trace. He's slippery, like the Joker card in a pack of cards.